social ecology on the one hand, because that's what I teach, and on the other hand, I wanted to put it into a bigger kind of current paradigm context of integral consciousness. But what we'll do is we'll start off with a video. Yeah, I'll just put it in. It's easy. That's all right. Look, it's just actually neat. Turn that on. Okay, so while this is, hang on, just let come through. Just get the technology happening. So we're going to show you one of the many videos that's on the Pachamama Alliance website, which is a fabulous website that shows you a lot of the work that the Pachamama Alliance do. And one of them is they organise these trips to Ecuador to be able to actually meet the Achua, who are the people that started this whole journey in terms of having a particular dream about their rainforest. And so I'll let them speak for themselves and then we'll talk some more. Okay.
Did you want to just straighten the screen?
Yeah.
I might shut that window too, as well, noise.
Okay.
Humanity is waking up to a new reality. We are discovering that the global industrial system aimed at improving the quality of life is actually threatening the natural systems that make life possible. At the heart of this crisis are two very different worldviews. One that sees that everything is connected and all life is sacred, and one that pursues progress and profit at the expense of nature and people. Nowhere is this conflict more evident than here, deep in the Amazon region of Ecuador, where one of the last untouched stands of rainforest has become a front line in this battle of worldviews. This is where the Pachamama Alliance began, with the Achua people of Ecuador, an ancient dream culture still living in harmony with their ancestral land. Nearly 2 million acres of pristine tropical rainforest. In the late 1980s, the Achua elders and shamans began having dreams and visions that a grave threat was coming to their people. The Achua soon realized what that threat was, as they began to see what contact with the outside world and its thirst for oil was doing to the land and cultures of their indigenous neighbors. And so, the Achua made a bold move. They reached out to create a partnership with the very world that was threatening to destroy them. In 1995, a call issued forth from the heart of the natural world that was heard thousands of miles away by a small group of people in the modern world. In the summer of that year, in a remote village in the rainforest, these two worlds came together, and the Pachamama Alliance was born. Since that time, this partnership has flourished, with financial and organizational support from the Pachamama Alliance and its foundation in Ecuador. The Achua have accessed skills and applied appropriate technologies that enable them to protect their land and culture. While remaining rooted in their traditional ways, they are developing alternative economic models, improving the health of their communities, and actively asserting their legal and collective rights at the national and international levels. The Pachamama Alliance now works with all the Achua's indigenous neighbors in Ecuador, as well as with indigenous groups in the neighboring border countries of Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. It is recognized as one of the most effective organizations working with indigenous people in all of Latin America. Since 1995, this alliance has helped preserve millions of acres of pristine tropical rainforest. But now, the world's ever-increasing demand for more resources, more oil, is threatening this entire region again.
From the very beginning, our indigenous partners told us that it was really great that we were working with them in the Amazon shoulder to shoulder. But that was only half the battle. They told us that if we really wanted to protect their lands permanently, we would need to go to work in our part of the world. And as they put it, we would need to change the dream of the North. the dream of the modern world. A dream rooted in consumption and acquisition, without any regard to the consequences to the natural world or even our own future.
Out of our work with them, we came to see that we in the modern world truly are in some kind of a trance, living a dream that's threatening not only the rainforest and their way of life, but the health and well-being of the entire planet.
So in response to the request that came from its indigenous partners, the Pachamama Alliance launched the Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream Symposium, an interactive educational experience whose mission is to bring forth a new dream, an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, socially just human presence on this planet.
That's a good idea.
Using powerful video modules featuring some of the world's most respected thinkers, the latest in-depth information about the world situation, and dynamic group interactions, the symposium is having a profound impact on people's lives, inspiring them to become agents of change in their communities.
Everywhere I go, people come up to me, often with tears in their eyes, and tell me about how the Awakening the Dreamer program has transformed their lives.
Since 2005, we've seen phenomenal growth in the symposium as people who've experienced it are moved to share it with others. This growing network, all volunteers, has presented Awakening the Dreamer in more than 70 countries in at least 10 languages. Its message is so universal and so powerful that now other organizations are adapting it and sharing it around the world.
Young people have adapted the message of the symposium to what they call a wake up, and are offering it at schools, colleges, and youth conferences worldwide.
What I love about the Wake Up experience is seeing young people go from apathy and depression to hope and inspired action in 3 hours. And in these urgent times, we have to step up. We're the ones we've been waiting for, and you know what? We're not waiting anymore.
Through the Awakening the Dreamer program, hundreds of thousands of people around the world have literally woken up to the possibility of a just, sustainable, and fulfilling future for all. Now, the Pachamama Alliance is creating ways for people to be actively engaged in creating that future. We're using communication tools made possible by the digital revolution, as well as powerful community-based programs that educate and inspire people to action. Our work is about creating a critical mass of conscious commitment and action that will change the dream of the modern world.
And it's become clear to me that we're working on nothing less than the sustainability of life itself. And that moves me to my core, that that's ultimately what the Pachamama Alliance is, not out of some arrogance, but out of the profound humility of being alive at a time when we can live the most meaningful lives any generation of humankind has ever lived.
The Pachamama Alliance brings together allies from different worlds, people of vision, passion, and commitment, who recognize the urgency and opportunity of this moment in time. Guided by ancestral wisdom and called to action by future generations, the people of Pachamama stand together to bring forth a new future, an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, socially just human presence on this planet.
Good video, isn't it?
Yeah, very inspiring.
Okay. So that's by way of introduction to our. One of the things that the Pachamama Alliance do is they have an eco-tourist kind of trip to Ecuador, and I went on that about 3 years ago. Was it 3 years ago? Anyway, it was a really amazing experience to actually go into the rainforest and meet the Achua and spend time living there. And we also visited some communities in the Andes who were Quechua-speaking communities. And we could see there that there was this completely different world going on. And one of the things that really impressed me with the Quechua in a village called San Clemente was that they had this medicine wheel. And I'd studied stuff about Native American culture, but I'd never realised that the medicine wheel is also an agricultural calendar. And the way it's set up with the 4 quadrants is that there's a pole in the middle and it lines up with the solstices and the equinoxes. And it tells people, this group of people for example, when they should plant their harvest, when they should reap, when they should do all their agricultural practices. What they were finding was because of climate change, they actually had to do it earlier. So this very ancient instrument was already measuring climate change. So while some people are in so-called denial, whatever that is, that it's happening, there's something going on where a traditional people like this that have been harvesting and sowing their seeds and doing this for, you know, certainly several thousand years, are having to change in order to deal with changing temperatures. So that was a very interesting part of it. Now, one of the people you saw there was a fellow called John Perkins, and this is a book that he wrote called The World is As You Dream It. He's actually a very interesting man because he wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Anyone come across that? Yeah. So where he talks about some of the things that happens in the economic world, and apparently the CIA were after him after that, so he raced off and disappeared in the Amazon for many years, and he became a shaman, and now what he does is actually taking people into the rainforest. And he takes students that he teaches at some university in the States into the rainforest. Now what's very interesting is that when, like the Achua, the indigenous people in Ecuador, had a dream that something was going to happen. Meanwhile, Lynn Twist, who you saw speaking there, who's been involved in lots of social change movements, she also had a dream. And when he spoke to her, because he was kind of connected with both people, he realised that she was dreaming about the Achua. And the Achua were dreaming about something terrible happening, which was the fact that there was going to be the opening possibilities of oil exploration in their rainforest, which would have, of course, destroyed their land significantly. So it's very interesting that he actually got them together. And so this book's called The World is As You Dream It. And we call it Changing the Dream, Awakening the Dreamer, because that's what the name of the symposium is. And we did many symposiums here a few years ago, or last year.
When are you going to do them again? Yeah.
Well, we can do some more. But the thing is that...
Put you to work.
But the thing is that we've done quite a few around Sydney, and it's always about the dream, and it's about how we address the dream of the modern world, which, as one of the other people on the video said, we're all entranced in. Now, part of the dream of the modern world is what a fellow called Jean Gebser called the mental consciousness. And this is one of the things I find really interesting, is that I didn't bring his book, but there's a book called Structures of Consciousness by a guy called George Feuerstein, who's written also a lot about yoga. But this is about a fellow called Jean Gebser, and he was like this Swiss, German, French cultural historian who was actually, in my sense, trying to work out. He was born in Prussia, and when the Nazis came along, he was feeling really uncomfortable, and he escaped into
With a name
Spain.
like that, he would be.
What?
With a name like that, he would be feeling uncomfortable.
And he ended up in Spain, and he was part of the revolution there for a short time, but then he had this impulse to leave, and his flat was blown up the next day, which is interesting, and he spent a couple of years in Paris with Picasso and a whole lot of intellectuals there, and then 3 hours before the borders were closed to Switzerland by the Nazis, he escaped into Switzerland. So I figured he had some guidance. He spent the war in Switzerland, and then he was really trying to analyse the cultural history of humanity, going right back to the original consciousness that he saw as the archaic consciousness, when humanity was completely part of nature. And he came up with these structures of consciousness. I won't go into it too much, but what he's arguing is that we've been stuck for 500 years in what he calls the mental consciousness. And the mental consciousness has been very useful in as much it's given us all this technology and it's given us the possibility of getting into aeroplanes and so on, but it's also given us things like nuclear weapons, and I know John works to try and get rid of, and it's given us a lot of problems, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, which you could see there, the kind of destruction that the resource so-called base requires. And this is what he would call the deficient cause of the mental consciousness. And so he was arguing we need a new consciousness now, which he called the integral consciousness. And that's been a really interesting shift, because a lot of people are talking about this paradigm shift. And, you know, there's a fellow called Amit Goswami. If anyone saw the film, What the Bleak Do We Know?
Oh, yeah.
So he was the Indian physicist in that. And I saw him speak in Sydney a couple of years back, how quantum activism can save civilization. Because he's basically arguing that quantum physicists are finding that everything is connected. So whereas we grow up, I certainly grew up thinking that I was separate from everybody else and I was this individual, and you know, you had to follow this fight and flight competitive world. Whereas in the reality that the quantum physicists are finding is that the space is alive, and we're all manifestations of space. And this is coming up very strongly in the work of a fellow called Erwin Laszlo, in this very recent book of his called Dawn of the Akashic Age. And Laszlo's work is very interesting. He's calling it New Consciousness, Quantum Resonance, and the Future of the World. And he's a very interesting man, because he started back in the 90s. He was asked by the United Nations to do a study of what was happening on the planet. And he discovered a lot of things were not going so well, but nobody wanted to take responsibility for it. So what happened, because he had a Hungarian background, apparently the president of Hungary said to him, if you support us or acknowledge us, we'll support you. So he started what was called the Club of Budapest. Now, he'd previously been involved in the Club of Rome. And do people know about the Club of Rome? Yeah. So that was started in 1972 at the first United Nations Conference on the Environment. And it was, by this stage, by the 90s, it was no longer really functioning, but the important thing that was coming out of that was a book called Limits to Growth. So it was the first time that, you know, Western industrial civilization realised that you can't just keep taking things from nature. There's a limit. And that's what the Club of Rome brought out. Now, the Club of Budapest that Erwin Laszlo started had a much broader vision. They had filmmakers, they had politicians, they had scientists, they had artists, they had composers. And, you know, it was a much more eclectic group of people. And not many people knew about the Club of Budapest. So later he called it World Shift. And I didn't bring that book, but it's now called World Shift. It was called World Shift 2012 because it was linked in with a Mayan prophecy of 2012. And now...
Nothing happened.
Everything's happening.
21st of December 2012, nothing happened.
Well, if you had been in Byron Bay, you would have seen it all happen. There was an Uplift Festival in Byron Bay on the 21st of December. It was extraordinary.
I was expecting the world to end.
No. That was a misunderstanding. We can talk about that later. But that was actually, like, from the Indigenous point of view, when I heard Mayam Shaman speak about it, the end of the day is the night. The end of the night is the day. The end of one era is the beginning of another era. You see, life is a continuous cycle of day and night, of season, cycle, summer, winter. And it's that kind of shift. It was a shift from 23,000 years of one particular structure that was existing to a new one, from the fourth sun to the fifth sun in this sort of complex calendar. But it wasn't, you see, in Western culture, there's this complete misunderstanding of the nature of reality, because we're placing so much emphasis on materiality, on the material world. And that's what the physicists are saying, that it doesn't work like that. There's a beautiful passage in here, which I'll read you, because it just brings in very much what we're talking about. Okay. So it's talking about the new paradigm in science and what it means for our life and times. Now, indigenous people have always said that everything's connected, right? And Buddhists say it's all about interconnectedness, interdependent co-arising. I am because you are, and you are because I am. There's no separation. And now this is what the physicists are finding. And I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs. Why is this new paradigm of such importance in regard to the thinking we need in our crisis-prone, rapidly evolving world? The answer is first and foremost because it gives us a sense of belonging. We are not separate individuals, pursuing our destiny in a strange, indifferent and hostile world. We belong to the world, and in the final analysis, we are one with the world. The Akashic paradigm turns our current picture of the world on its head. In the everyday context, we think that the things we see are real, and that space, the space that embeds them, is empty. So we think this is solid, and it's real. But if you look at it under an electron microscope, it's actually empty space, with lots of these little things jumping around that we call atoms or molecules. And that's basically what he's saying, that it is the space, in the new paradigm, we now turn this around, it is the space that embeds things that is real. And the things that move about in space that are secondary. So it's a very interesting concept, and it's completely different to how we think. This is the deep dimension of the world of the ancient rishis called Akasha. Their intuition is now confirmed at the cutting edge of the sciences. So what's very interesting is that Akasha is the Sanskrit word for ether. Now, if you know anything about physics in the Western world, there was this pair called Michelson and Morley in somewhere 1890 something. They disproved the existence of ether because they couldn't measure it. Now, what's very interesting, in a book called The Science Delusion, Rupert Sheldrake says that in 1984, a group of NASA scientists actually proved ether existed. And it was reported in Nature magazine, which is one of the very reputable scientific journals. But it's not really impacted very much, because if space is real, if ether is real, then our whole concept of reality is upside down. You see? And what happens though in quantum physics, you have phenomena like entanglement, where things are connected, and you have this, you know, like if you've got one particle here and one particle here, and you change this one, and they're entangled, this one actually changes. But there's no communication directly. It could be on the other side of the universe. There's no actual connection except that they're part of the same space.
And most of our matter is the matter we see, but most matter is black matter.
Well, that's right. Now scientists are saying that 94% or something of the universe is either black matter or black energy, or dark matter or dark energy. So we only actually see 4% with our eyes or with our senses. So there's a great mystery out there, and that's what people like Laszlo are tuning into. And you know, and there's books like this one, Duane Elgin, called The Living Universe, basically saying that the universe is alive. Space is alive. Everything is alive, and we are part of that living entity. We're part of all that. And this is what Gebser came up with as an integral consciousness. And while there's a fellow called Ken Wilber, who most people, when I talk about integral consciousness, most people think of Ken Wilber, and he's actually been a very useful ambassador, if you like, for integral consciousness. But his version of it is still, if you look at his work, it's very mental, it's very analytical. And it's useful because it's good to analyse stuff, and it's kind of fun. But it's not quite the same as what Gebser proposed, because Gebser met a fellow called Sri Aurobindo, who was one of the great gurus who died around 1950 in India. And it was through talking to Aurobindo and communing with him that he had this idea that the next consciousness needed to be this integral consciousness. And then he went to the deer park and he had a Satori experience, like an enlightenment experience. And he was really quite amazing. He ended up in Switzerland and pretty much survived by working, teaching at the Jung Institute there.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting is that the Buddhists and the Sufis have had this same view as... Oh, did you bring the other book? No, that's all right. So there's a fellow called Andrew Harvey who's been recently here a few times. What's interesting, he's done a lot of translations of Rumi, and so he's coming very much from a Sufi perspective, and he started what's called sacred activism. And again, it's a very interesting movement. His book's called The Hope, and he draws a lot on the poetry of Rumi, who was a Sufi, 800 years ago. And he's basically saying that Rumi's poetry is incredibly relevant. And if you hear him speak, he's very operatic, he's very dramatic, Andrew. And in fact, when I went to Ecuador, I was hoping he was going to be on that trip, because that was on the Pachamama Alliance website that he was going there, but he didn't. He came to Australia instead. But he ended up meeting a fellow called Uncle Bob Randall.
Oh,
Yeah. And on his last trip here, he actually went to Central Australia and spent time with Uncle Bob. So there's this really interesting connections. And so bringing in this Indigenous way of looking at things, this is a wonderful book I've had for some time. And it gives you, it's by a fellow called Bill Nedgy. And he was one of the last people that, it's called Kakadu Man. He was one of the last people in his culture that, maintained the dreaming. And he talks about, he starts with, it's all about a story. I give you this story. I give you this story, this proper story, true story. People can listen. I'm telling this while you've got time. Time for you to make something, history, book. I was thinking, no history written for us when white Europeans start here. Only a few words written. Should be more than that. And he goes on to talk about how, I'll just read a few bits. This earth I never damage, I look after. And he talks about fire, because there's fire stick farming. Fire is nothing, just clean up. When you burn, new grass coming up. That means good animals soon. Might be goose, long-necked turtle, goanna, possum. Burn him off. New grass coming up, new life all over. I don't know about white European way. We Aborigine burn, make things grow. Tree grow. Every night he grow. Daylight he stop. Just about dark he start again. Just about morning I look, I say, oh, nice tree this. When you sleep, tree growing like others trees. They got lots of blood. And it's really beautiful the way it's written. It's written in Aboriginal English, which is actually a legitimate language, but sadly is not always, it's recognised by the Department of Education, but it's not always recognised by teachers. And it's a really powerful direct language where he's talking about this relationship to the earth. And as he says here, our story is in the land. It is written in those sacred places. My children will look after those places. That's the law. Dreaming place. You can't change it no matter who you are. No matter you rich man, no matter you king, you can't change it. So again, of course with Aboriginal people, you have the dreaming. You have this whole idea that the dream is what creates the reality. And as John Perkins says, the world is as you dream it.